Welcome to the third and final installment of Road to the Civil War. And we begin this episode with a look at Harper's Ferry. Once again, the infamous John Brown from Pottawatomie Creek leads an attack upon Harper's Ferry, which is in Virginia, and was a federal arsenal. In October of 1859, he leads about 20 heavily armed men along the Potomac River to try to capture this arsenal to try and encourage a slave revolt. Now, he had spent the last several years in the North gathering arms and money and support to try to do this. However, once he and his men take control of the arsenal, they don't find slaves rushing from the countryside to join them in this revolt. And so Brown and his men kind of hunker in to try to defend themselves and save their own lives. But the military is eventually, called in and led by one Colonel Robert E. Lee, who eventually puts this little rebellion down and either captures or kills most of these men that were involved. Eventually, John Brown himself is captured and taken off to jail, and he's eventually sentenced to be executed, and he'll be sent to the gallows, which will kind of be protected by the military to try to keep people away. But it was Brown who was willing to die for this cause of trying to abolish slavery. And his famous quote where he says, the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. And he's kind of saying that it's going to take the spilling of more blood to try to free this nation from slavery, something that's not too far off in the future. For it is the election of 1860 that is really kind of the beginning of the end of our Union at this time. We see Abraham Lincoln run on the Republican ticket. He's going against Stephen Douglas, who is a Northern Democrat, John C. Breckinridge, who's a Southern Democrat, and John Bell, who is the Constitutional Union. But we see this relatively new Republican Party, try to gain more support and solidify, itself in the North, as it truly was a sectional party, because Lincoln wasn't even on a lot of the ballots in the South. In fact, this Republican Party, kind of brought together various ideas. We talked about before how it wanted the non-extension of slavery. So kind of bringing the support from the Free Soilers. It also wanted a more of a protective tariff. This would help Northern industrialists. They looked to try to build internal improvements, which would help connect the West out east, and they're willing to do this at the federal expense. Furthermore, they're looking to try to give away free homesteads of the public domain out west, which would kind of give more farmland for people to move west and kind of populate those territories and states. And they're also looking to build a transcontinental railroad, which would kind of, again, connect the Northwest and those northern states. So it truly was a sectional party. And as you can see, people really kind of thought that the nation was being torn apart, as Lincoln, like I said, wasn't even on the ballots in the South, and you've got the split in the Democratic Party, and you have all this other mayhem going on dealing with slavery. It truly was ripping apart the nation. And with that said, you can see by the map here that Lincoln was able to win the presidency with only support of northern free states. And because of that, because there was a greater population, that means there was more electoral votes in the North, the South knew that their way of life was in jeopardy. They would never equal the strength of their northern counterparts. And therefore, with the election of Lincoln, the South really believed that their way of life was in jeopardy. But in one last-ditch effort to try to save the Union, Senator John Crittenden from Kentucky proposes the Crittenden Compromise. And what this proposed was to try to extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the Pacific Ocean guaranteeing that slavery would never be, disallowed in those states or territories. Now, it never passes Congress, and it really was too late because after Lincoln's victory in November of 1860, we see South Carolina lead the secessionist movement by December of 1860. And those deep southern states in blue all secede even before Lincoln is inaugurated in 1861. And those purple states will secede shortly after the attack on Fort Sumter, April 12th, 1861. And what amounts to be basically the first shots fired of the Civil War, these southern forts, Confederate forts in red, were firing upon Fort Sumter at the mouth of Charleston Harbor, which is located in South Carolina. And over this time period, there wasn't one single casualty from this bombardment. However, Lincoln also refused to send in reinforcements because he didn't want to make it look like he was the one that was starting the Civil War. And after this 24-hour period, eventually a truce was hammered out and agreed upon that allowed the federal troops to kind of leave and go back up to the north and allowed the Confederate states to assume control of this fort. And this really was the beginning of the Civil War, which is something we'll be taking a closer look at in our next episode.